Bonjour à tous, welcome back to FrenchArena. Je suis Sumo, votre professeur de français. Today, we're diving into reflexive verbs in le passé composé, a tense used to talk about actions completed in the past. Vous êtes prêts? C'est parti! In my previous lesson, we discussed all about the French reflexive verbs in the present tense. So if you haven't watched that yet, I would advise you pause today's lesson and click this link above to watch that lesson so you can understand reflexive verbs in the present tense, how to conjugate them, how to identify them easier before you dive into reflexive verbs in le passé composé. But if you've already watched that lesson or you have a general idea of what reflexive verbs are in the present tense, then today's lesson is definitely for you. Before we get started, a quick refresher. What are reflexive verbs? Reflexive verbs are verbs where the subject performs the action on itself. That is, they use reflexive pronouns that match the subject. For more practice and a deeper understanding, I have created the perfect ebook for you. This ebook contains everything we're going to learn today, additional examples, a quiz and exercises for you, and tips to help you master reflexive verbs in le passé composé. Reflexive verbs use être as the auxiliary verbs to form le passé composé, not avoir. They use only être. And they must always agree in gender and number of the subject. Now, before we get started on how to conjugate reflexive verbs in le passé composé, let's take a quick look at how to conjugate être in the present tense first of all. This would make it easier for you to understand the structure on how to conjugate the reflexive verbs in le passé composé. Je suis, tu es, il ou elle ou on est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils ou elles sont. Okay, so you remember now how to conjugate être. You always know how to conjugate être in the present tense. Now, let's take a look at an ER verb, okay? We're going to conjugate laver in le passé composé. Don't worry, stick with me. You would see why I'm conjugating it, because once you understand how to conjugate each of them, it makes it so easy for you to conjugate reflexive verbs in le passé composé. Let us conjugate laver together in le passé composé. J'ai lavé. Tu as lavé. Il, elle, on a lavé. Nous avons lavé. Vous avez lavé. Ils ou elles ont lavé. Okay, so you got that right. You know how to conjugate être in the present tense. You know how to conjugate any ER verb in le passé composé. Now, how do we conjugate reflexive verbs in le passé composé? It's simple. This is the perfect structure to follow. Number one, you choose the correct auxiliary verb. Okay, remember it's in être. Number two, you conjugate être in the present tense. Number three, we add the past participle of the reflexive verb. And number four, we agree the past participle with the subject. There you have it, the perfect structure for remembering how to conjugate in le passé composé. Let us conjugate laver together in le passé composé for reflexive verbs. Je me suis lavé. Tu t'es lavé. Il s'est lavé. Elle s'est lavée. Nous nous sommes lavés. Vous vous êtes lavés. Ils se sont lavés. Elles se sont lavées. Do you see that the feminine plural and the feminine singular has an extra E? That is it agreeing with the gender and number. So it's really important for you to remember this. Please, that with être, when you're using être to form le passé composé for reflexive verbs, it always has to agree with the gender and number. Let's take a look at a sample sentence. Number one sample sentence. Hier matin, je me suis lavé les mains avant de prendre le petit déjeuner. And another sample sentence. Elle s'est lavée rapidement avant de partir au travail. Okay, so do you understand how to conjugate an ER verb? Let's take a look at another one just to explain it further to you. Let's look at s'aimer. S'aimer, and this means what? To love oneself. S'aimer. Je me suis aimé. Tu t'es aimé. Il s'est aimé. Elle s'est aimée. Nous nous sommes aimés. Vous vous êtes aimés. Ils se sont aimés. Elles se sont aimées. So do you see once again that it's agreeing with the gender and the number of the subject pronoun? This is extremely important. Please do not forget this crucial aspect of conjugating the reflexive verb in le passé composé. Il s'est aimé davantage après avoir vu le portrait. Okay, let's take a look at another verb conjugated in le passé composé. S'asseoir. S'asseoir, and this means to sit down. Je me suis assis. Tu t'es assis. Il s'est assis. Elle s'est assis. Nous nous sommes assis. Vous vous êtes assis. Ils se sont assis. elles se sont assises. Another reflexive verb in le passé composé, se prendre. Se prendre. Je me suis pris. Tu t'es pris. Il s'est pris. Elle s'est prise. Nous nous sommes pris. Vous vous êtes pris. Ils se sont pris. Elles se sont prises. You can say ils se sont pris en photo. Let's take a look at one more. Se souvenir. Se souvenir. Je me suis souvenu. Tu t'es souvenu. Il s'est souvenu. Elle s'est souvenue. Nous nous sommes souvenus. Vous vous êtes souvenus. Ils se sont souvenus. Elles se sont souvenues. Pretty easy, right? And I could say, elle se souvenu de son anniversaire grâce au rappel sur son téléphone. So, there we have it. We have conjugated various reflexive verbs in le passé composé, and I'm hoping it's way easier for you now. Please remember, like I said, if you know how to conjugate être in the present tense, and you know how to conjugate another verb in the passé composé, it's way easier for you to then add them together and get the reflexive verb in le passé composé. By following the structured approach, you can correctly form reflexive verbs in le passé composé in French. Now it's your turn to practice. Let's have a quick quiz. So in today's quiz, I'm going to read out a text to you. You're going to see it very soon. This text that you're going to hear and equally read, I want you to pick out the reflexive verbs. Let me know in the comment section just before I show the answers. Obviously, hi Sumo, I got 20, I got 10 reflexive verbs, I got 1. Just let me know. I would love to read from you. Hier matin, je me suis levé tôt et je me suis préparé un café. Ensuite, je me suis installée pour travailler. Pendant ce temps, elle s'est habillée pour la réunion. Ils se sont rencontrés à midi et se sont salués chaleureusement. Nous nous sommes promenés dans le parc et nous nous sommes reposés. Enfin, ils se sont quittés en souriant. Perfect work. Were you able to pick out all the reflexive verbs? Don't worry, you're going to see the answers to reflexive verbs. And so here are the answers. Do you see how many reflexive verbs were in that story? Do not worry if you didn't get it all. The most important thing is for you to have an understanding of how the structure works. You can equally watch this video again. And do not forget, like I said, I have the perfect ebook for you. In that ebook, you have every single thing we learned today, more tips, more exercises, and more sample sentences to get you to master the French reflexive verbs in le passé composé even better. To practice more on your own, you can equally try forming sentences with the verbs in le passé composé. Remember, être is the auxiliary verb for reflexive verbs in le passé composé. Thank you so much for watching today's fantastic lesson. If you enjoyed today's lesson, please give it a thumbs up, share with anyone else who might not understand reflexive verbs in le passé composé, and equally subscribe so that you get notified for more interesting French lessons. Until I see you in my next lesson, bonne journée!